Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
IV. Unequal higher education. Brown versus Board of Education. White colleges and universities largely refused to admit African Americans. 294 in response, African Americans raised funding to develop historically black colleges and universities (HBCUs). In the early 1900s, the federal government began to funding and land to open HBCUs, but it had to pass through white-controlled state legislatures. However, these historically black institutions have been unequally funded in comparison to similar historically white institutions throughout American history. Chapter 6. An Unequal Education. World War II, the GI Bill paid for veterans to attend college, graduate school, and go through training programs. 95 Although the GI Bill should have helped black and white veterans equally, due to black veterans' exclusion from white colleges, the lack of black veterans administration counselors, and the tendency of white counselors to steer black veterans into vocational programs, really increased the racial higher education gap between black and white Americans. 96 Even today, black military veterans continue to face discriminatory barriers that can result in unequal access to education benefits available to veterans. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1964 again promised some relief through a prohibition on discrimination in higher education programs receiving federal funds, and some colleges and universities took affirmative action to remedy prior discrimination in college admissions, short-lived due to Supreme Court decisions and, in California, passage of Proposition 209, which prohibited race from being used as a factor in admissions. Funding for historically black colleges and universities prior to the Civil War, a few colleges for free African Americans existed in the North, and none in the South. 297 In 1862, the federal government under the First Morrill Act granted federal land and funding to states to open colleges and universities, but African Americans were generally not allowed to attend. 98 After the Civil War ended in 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau began establishing black colleges staffed by Civil War veterans with the support of white and black religious missionaries. 99 White missionaries funded black education in order to Christianize the menace of an educated enslaved people. 300 These colleges were in name only and, like many white colleges at the time, generally provided only primary and secondary education. 301 1890 Congress passed the Second Morrill Act and required states to provide higher education to black students as the states had for white students. 302 In the North, where black students were allowed to attend colleges and universities in extremely limited numbers, they often were not allowed to fully participate in the way that white, male students participated. 303 To continue receiving federal funding, former enslaving states, where the majority of African Americans lived, built segregated public black colleges. 4 White-controlled legislatures underfunded black colleges and universities, provided substandard facilities, and did not provide adequate resources to faculty. 305 White-controlled Southern legislatures limited curriculum to mechanical, agricultural, and industrial arts, helping maintain African Americans as a servant underclass to build white wealth. 306 Two graduate programs admitted black students, although after World War II, the NAACP successfully sued to expand graduate education opportunities for black students. 7 Although a few black people were allowed to attend predominantly white institutions, 90% of all black degree holders in the late 1940s had been educated at historically black colleges and universities. The eve of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, black people were less than 1% of entering first-year students at predominantly white institutions. 308 After the Brown decision, white government officials in the South used state power to prohibit integration efforts, including in Mississippi. 9 In 1959, Clyde Kennard, a 31-year-old black veteran of the Korean War, who ran a small poultry farm, applied to Mississippi Southern College, now the University of Southern Mississippi. And the university president reported Kennard's intention to apply to the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, a state agency led by the governor of Mississippi, which was created in order to preserve segregation. 111 After refusing to back down from applying to the university, even after the Mississippi governor requested that he withdraw his application, Kennard's local cooperative foreclosed on his farm and local government officials arrested and falsely convicted him for stealing $25 of chicken feed. 312 Kennard was sentenced to 7 years in a chain gang where he picked cotton and was fed white price owners leftover food. 313 Kennard died of misdiagnosed and untreated colon cancer in 1963. 14. Segregated higher education continued into the 1970s. In 1969 and 1970, the Federal Department of Education concluded that Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Florida, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Maryland, and Virginia operated segregated colleges and universities, and, in 1970, the ACP sued the Federal Department of Education for failing to force these institutions to desegregate. 15 By the late 1970s, many years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, at least 17 Southern states were still operating racially segregated higher education systems. 116 A number of public HBCUs closed or merged with traditionally white institutions, but most black college students continued to attend HBCUs. 117 HBCUs continued to struggle with poorer facilities and budgets compared to traditionally white institutions. Some lacked adequate libraries and scientific and research equipment. 318. Separate and unequal education. The underfunding. Through the 1970s, private and public HBCUs educated a large proportion of the African American middle class. 19 In 2006, HBCUs made up 3% of higher education but enrolled 14% of black undergraduates, and graduated 28% of all black undergraduate students who earned a degree. 70% of America's black doctors, 35% of black lawyers, and 50% of black engineers and teachers have a degree from an HBCU. 21 For black students, HBCUs can provide an empowering, family-like environment of small classes and close relationships with faculty and students away from racial tensions experienced off campus. 322. Increased access for black students to all colleges and universities has led to a relative decrease in enrollment to HBCUs. 23 While black enrollment at HBCUs increased by 17% between 1976 and 2018, the total number of black students enrolled in all degree-granting post-secondary institutions more than doubled during this period. 24 In 2018, there were 101 HBCUs located in 19 states, including one in Los Angeles, the Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science. 125 However, funding for HBCUs continues to be uneven and is tied to a state's fiscal health. 326 Reports in 2008 and 2014 concluded that state governments continue to deprioritize funding public HBCUs, leading to predominantly white universities receiving more funding per student than HBCUs. 127 In 2008, for example, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill received about $15,700 in state funding per student. 28 But students at historically black North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University received about $7,800 in state funding per student. 29 In 2020, the federal government increased funding for HBCUs, but many HBCUs have closed in recent years due to financial issues, a trend that has worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic. 330. Unequal access to the GI Bill. Expanded education opportunities and funding under the GI Bill. Between 1950 and 1975, black student college enrollment increased from 83,000 to 666,000 students. 31 However, in comparison to white veterans who used GI Bill benefits to go to college, state officials and the structure of the program generally prevented black veterans from accessing the full education benefits available to them. 32. World War II, the vast majority of black veterans returned to their residence in the southern states. 133 universities in the South did not accept black students, and white state legislatures did not increase funding to historically black colleges and universities to meet increased demand from returning veterans. 34 Many HBCUs had huge waiting lists, and applicants might have to wait a year or more to learn whether they had been admitted. During the post-war period, approximately 55% of black veteran applicants to HBCUs were rejected. 335 in the North, where less than a quarter of African Americans lived at the time. Although public universities admitted black students, many private colleges and universities continued to reject black students, or only admitted them in small numbers. 136 local Veterans Administration officials in the South were overwhelmingly white, and steered black people to vocational programs that funneled them to menial jobs or prohibited use of the GI Bill to pay for college. 137 Only 12% of black veterans were able to use the GI Bill to enroll in college, compared to 26% for veterans as a whole. 138 Although African Americans used the educational benefits of the GI Bill more often than white Americans did, they could not use those benefits for college, like white Americans could. Denied entrance to white colleges and universities and often steered away from college degree programs and into vocational tracks. 339 As a result, the educational and economic gap between white and African Americans widened. 140 See Chapter 13 The Wealth Gap for further discussion of related issues. Discrimination in access to healthcare, employment, and housing continues to limit access to education benefits in the GI Bill for black veterans compared to white veterans. 141 While African Americans make up 16.9% of the U.S. active duty force, studies show that black veterans are not utilizing their benefits as much as white or Asian American veterans due to the aforementioned barriers. 142 Proficiencies of affirmative action. Affirmative action began as a concept with President John F. Kennedy issuing an executive order 61 requiring that federal contractors take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed, and that employees are treated during employment, without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. Establishing the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. 43 3 years later, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to ban discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin not only in employment, but also in education. 144 With respect to employment, the Federal Department of Labor ordered all federal contractors to prepare affirmative action plans including goals and timetables to improve the employment standing of specific groups of people, including African Americans. 345 His 1965 commencement address at Howard University, President Lyndon Johnson stated that affirmative action should be approached as a moral and policy response to the material and psychological losses suffered by African Americans during and after the time of slavery. 146 He declared, "You do not take a person who, for years, has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair." 147 Further, he emphasized the importance of African Americans' humanity and stated that what African Americans sought was, not just freedom but opportunity, not just legal equity but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and as a result. 348 1960s and 1970s, some colleges and graduate schools began to develop similar affirmative action policies to increase the number of black and other underrepresented students. 349 After the assassination of Dr. Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, civil rights leaders pushed for colleges to admit more black students. 50 In 1969, the next school year, the number of black students admitted to America's elite universities rose sharply, some by more than 100%. 351 The lawsuits came quickly. In 1971, 2 years after schools adopted affirmative action policies, a white student sued the University of Washington Law School, citing racism as the reason for his rejection. 352 Because of this case, Harvard alumni believe that semi-literate blacks are being accepted at the expense of white geniuses, said David L. Evans, Associate Dean of Admissions at Harvard in 1975. 78. When the former nearly all-white colleges and universities were still admitting fewer black students than black high school graduates, the Supreme Court decided in the Regents of the University of California versus Back. It's an university's ability to take race-based affirmative actions to address education discrimination. 153 The Supreme Court declared that the policy of the University of California at Davis's medical school to set aside 16 of 100 total seats for minority groups, like African Americans, was unconstitutional because it prevented white students from competing for the 16 seats set aside. 154 The Supreme Court declared in back and subsequent cases that if a college or university wanted to have a more diverse class of students or make up for societal discrimination against African Americans in the United States, then it could only consider race as a factor. Many other factors, and with limitations. 355. Doing so, the Supreme Court rejected affirmative action programs, like Davis's program, that were intended to compensate black students and other racial minority groups for the ways that federal, state, and local government had discriminated against them in education for more than 200 years. On account of their race. Instead, the Supreme Court described the American his discrimination as societal discrimination, that is, amorphous and ageless into the past, which colleges and universities could not fix through programs taken by the Federal Security Agency, National Youth Administration. The original caption written by the federal agency stated, Bakersfield, California. These Negro youth are returning to their squalid homes in the Sunset District of Bakersfield. 1940. Courtesy of RONDAL Partridge National Archives. Davis. 356 At the same time, federal courts have not struck down university and college admissions policies, which provide a preference for legacy admissions, students whose parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents attended the university or college. 57 The argument is that such preferences are not race-based, but this does not grapple with the fact that white legacies may have received a preference in admission because they did not need to compete with black students who were excluded from the admissions pool for centuries. 158 Critics of the current way that colleges and universities practice affirmative action as sanctioned by the Supreme Court argue that using student diversity as a reason to include race as a factor does not address the original intention of desegregation or break down structural barriers for students. 359. Percentage of black college students has risen in the past 50 years, but it has fallen recently. Percentage of American college students who are black increased from 10% in 1976 to 14% in 2017, but has dropped since from its high of 15% in 2011. 60 College enrollment rates for black 18 to 24-year-old Americans still lag behind those for Asian and white Americans of the same age. 61 A 2020 study found that, since 2000, the percentage of black students enrolled has decreased at nearly 60% of the 101 most selective public colleges and universities. 162 Researchers identify that one cause of declining enrollment is a focus on standardized testing as an admissions requirement because the scores from such testing do not reflect the potential or ability of black students but rather the inequities that black students experience throughout their education career, from less access to high-quality early education to a greater likelihood of attending schools with less funding, fewer experienced teachers, and fewer rigorous course options. 163 Other causes for declining enrollment include closure of for-profit colleges and declines at two-year public colleges due to unemployment. Black students are overrepresented at both types of colleges. 364. California. 96. California voters passed Proposition 209, which eliminated consideration of race in public education admissions, regardless of longstanding segregation and past discrimination. 165 This has had significant impacts on black and other students of color in California. 166 In 2020, a University of California, Berkeley study found that this affirmative action ban has harmed black and Latino students by significantly reducing enrollment across the University of California campuses and lowering their graduation rates. 67. 2006 study found that black admissions had plummeted since the ban on affirmative action, particularly at the University of California, Los Angeles and Berkeley campuses. 168 In 2020, the president of the University of California Student Association, Varsha Sarveshwar, commented that the exclusion of black and Latino students from selective colleges and universities is nothing short of a crisis. Out of 9 UC undergraduate campuses received D and F grades in access for black and Latino students. 369 Sarveshwar called on higher education leaders and policymakers to move beyond public commitments to diversity and act decisively to ensure that access is truly equitable. 170. Continued nature of the uneven playing field between black and white students was highlighted in a recent legal settlement between student and community groups and the University of California. 171 The lawsuit, leading up to the settlement, was brought by then 19-year-old Kawika Smith, a high school student from South Los Angeles. That the use of SAT and ACT scores in admissions and university scholarship decisions may be discriminatory because they are proxies for wealth and race. Only exacerbate the gaps that exist due to unequal exam preparation between schools and based on whether parents can pay for private test tutors. 72. In addition, research has shown that black students may perform poorly on standardized tests, not because of genetic or cultural differences, but because negative stereotypes raise doubts and high-pressure anxieties in a test-taker's mind. 73. Kawika Smith told the task force at its October 2021 hearing that when he thought back to the day he took the SAT, he was immediately met with this memory of feeling that I wasn't worthy or capable of being in a collegiate environment. Singular test determined that I would not be eligible for scholarship opportunities despite my academic and having been in need of financial support to afford college. 74. The legal settlement with the University of California ensures that SAT and ACT scores not be used in admission and scholarship decisions until spring 2025. 75.